Dorothy is Professor Emerita of Iowa State University. She was in the classroom there for 34 years before retiring in 2000. She is a prolific writer. She is the preeminent Iowa historian in central Iowa, maybe in the state, maybe in the universe. But she is an expert on Iowa history, and among historians, that is a rare and special thing. Dorothy, just last fall, published the story about Jack Trice that you're going to hear tonight in the State Historical Society of Iowa's publication, The Annals of Iowa. The fall 2010 issue is available here at the Iowa State University Iowa State University Library for checkout and for purchase through the State Historical Society. So if you would like to read more or read the complete story, it has been published, and we're very, very grateful for that. Please welcome Dorothy with her story about Jack Trice.
Thank you for coming out on cold winter's night. I would like to thank, before we get started here, two groups at Iowa State that really got me started in doing this research. The Museum Association and the Athletic Department. About 3 years ago, they were thinking about doing a new sculpture of Jack Trice. One already existed, you'll see a slide of that later, but they were going to do a second one as well. And they assumed that the sculptor would probably not be from Iowa, that he would need to have some background on the climate in the 1920s, the social climate, things such as racial discrimination in the 1920s, and also work on Jack Trice, where Jack Trice grew up when he came to Iowa, and how things have played out here. And so I wish to thank both the Museum Association, the Athletic Department for support in doing that research, because what I will talk about tonight really came out of that work. Now, I have to bear with me a bit here. This is something that's a little new. The place to start is, of course, the stadium, Jack Trice Stadium. Everyone has driven by that many times. In fact, you probably have driven by it so often that you don't even think about the name. Most people know a bit about Jack Trice. They know that he was a football player. They know that he was very, very badly injured in a football game, that he died several days later. Oftentimes, this is sort of the extent. Oh, one thing should be added to that. They also know that this happened a long time ago. It happened in 1923. But beyond that, probably information is rather limited. So, what we'll talk about tonight, Jack Trice's background and more about his time at Iowa State. Then the third thing will be the campaign, and it really was a campaign by students at Iowa State from 1973 to 1997 to convince the administration that that stadium should be named after Jack Trice. Jack Trice was born in Ohio in 1902. His parents had come from the South, from the state of Tennessee, to Ohio after the Civil War. Jack Trice's grandparents had been former slaves. His legal name was actually John Trice, after his father. His parents were John Trice and Anna Trice. He was born in Hiram, a small town in northeastern Ohio, close to the community of Cleveland. This is his graduation photo. And the second one here shows the football team that Jack Trice played on, Cleveland's East Technical High School. And it shows Jack Trice standing very proudly with his letter sweater for the technical school. His mother had felt that when he lived in Hyra, a very small town, that he wasn't really being exposed to what the real world would be like for a young African-American boy. So she made arrangements with relatives in Cleveland that Jack would attend high school there. And this presumably would introduce him to a more realistic situation. And of course, when we keep in mind that this was in the 1920s, there was a great deal of discrimination. He was an outstanding athlete at East Technical High School. He would come to Iowa State in 1922 when his high school coach, Sam Williman, was hired as the football coach at Iowa State. Sam Williman apparently had about 6 players who he thought were very, very good, and he invited these 6 players to come with him, enroll at Iowa State, play football at Iowa State. And Jack Trice was one of the players. When they would arrive in Ames, 1922, the community of Ames had about 6,200 people. The census in 1920 tells us that 34 were African American. So a very, very small African American community here. What Jack would see would be scenes such as this. This is Main Street in the 1920s looking west. He would see buildings such as this. This would be later Collegiate Manufacturing Company, but originally it was the Tilden Manufacturing Company, and probably you would recognize this today as the Octagon. Jack Trice, like all football players, would hold down at least one job, maybe 2. There were no football scholarships, so the coaches would help the players find various jobs. We know that Jack worked at one business in Ames, and he actually was given a room for his place to stay. We don't know if it was Tilden Manufacturing Company, but we know it was probably similar to that. He would see a campus. You see State Gym down in the left-hand corner, the Water Tower, Marston Hall. If the view of Central Campus would be what you see here. You see the Campanile, Curtis Hall, and of course what was Agricultural Hall. It is now Tech Hall in the middle of the photograph. Also another view of State Gym, and you see the bleachers in the foreground for what was then called simply State Football Stadium. In 1938, it would be named after Clyde Williams Field. His freshman coach, and I should mention at this time that the varsity team did not include freshmen. It was a separate freshman team. And the coach for that freshman team, first is a photo of the freshman squad. They had a schedule of their own. In fact, they also had, I don't know if you call them scrimmages or games with the varsity, but they also had games with other freshman teams. This was the freshman coach. His name was E.E. Myland, and his nickname was Hooks. We don't know any more than that, but Hooks. He made the statement that before the team that included Jack Trice, before that team arrived at Iowa State, that the team players simply had no fight. But once the new freshman team came in, which included Jack Trice, the team finally had some fight. Jack Trice would major in animal husbandry. He told friends that he hoped after graduation he would be able to go south, work with some of the black sharecroppers, the black farmers in the South. During the summer between his freshman and sophomore year, Jack Trice would go back to Hiram. He would work probably for a construction company on roads. He would do road work. But also that summer, he would marry a young woman by the name of Cora Starlin. She would come with him back to Iowa State in the fall of the year, and she would enroll in courses in home economics. His sophomore year, of course, Jack Trice would play on the varsity team. This is a picture, or a photo rather, of Sam Williman, and apparently the assistant coach, as you see here, was his brother, Frank Williman. And Sam Williman had been the one who brought everyone along from Ohio. This is a very, very well-known photo of Jack Trice. It adorns, it's in many displays, it's on the front of many magazines, many historical journals. And this is another photo that is very, very well known. Two brothers came along. In fact, these four were among the 6 that came from Ohio to play with Sam Williman. The fellow to Jack Trice's left and the fellow to his right were brothers. And many years later, a sports writer in Cleveland would track down the man on the end. His name was Johnny Bean. And he would talk to him about what he remembered about the days he played football with Jack Trice. He told some interesting stories. He said that Jack Trice was so good that they would hire a special coach to come in to scrimmage with him, and that this fellow actually played for a professional football team in Chicago. He would take the train back and forth. So Jack Trice, his ability was recognized very, very quickly. This is a picture as well of the team, and you notice the similarity in the jerseys that the football players are wearing. This was a view of one of the football games. It is quite a contrast from what we know today with Jack Trice Field. You can't help but notice that the stands are not very full. I'm reminded of a piece that Tom Crochelle, who was a part of the athletics department at Iowa State, he did a history of athletics at Iowa State. And he mentioned that in the 1890s, when football was just really getting started, that the students didn't know much about football, the faculty didn't, nobody was really very interested. It took a while for interest in this sport to really develop. And I couldn't help but think about that in looking at this particular slide. The first game of the varsity season that included Jack Trice was with Simpson. The players sort of looked past that game. Simpson was a very small school. They knew that their team would not be very good. The varsity team won that game. The team they really, really looked forward to was the game with Minnesota. Minnesota was known as a football powerhouse. And although it was the second game of the season, the players really considered it the very first major football game to get everything started. They knew it would be a very tough game. Minnesota had done well and had a very good reputation. The team would travel to Minneapolis by train. They would stay at the Curtis Hotel. There's some question as to where Jack Trice would eat his meals. The rest of the team, Jack Trice was the only black player. The rest of the team would eat their meals in the dining room. But certain comments were made that lead one to believe that maybe Jack Trice had to eat his meals at a separate location. That was not an unusual situation in the 1920s. Jack Trice, the night before the game, would do something that maybe was a bit unusual for a football player. He would write a letter, unusual in the sense that he really felt he needed to get down some of his own concerns about that game. He wrote a letter, and he entitled it, "To Whom It May Concern." He wrote about his feelings before what he called the big game. He talked about the aspirations he had as a black man. He wrote in part, "The honor of my race, family, and self are at stake. Everyone is expecting big things. I will." And he had underlined will several times. He said he would do everything he could to win the game, including, and he mentioned a specific play. It was called a rolling block. And he mentioned, if necessary to win the game, he would carry out that rolling block. The game, of course, was played then. Trice was injured in the first, probably about the first half of the game. He had actually suffered a broken collarbone. I don't believe they really knew the extent of that injury. He knew that he had some pain, but he continued to play. In the third quarter, he was injured very, very badly, and it was obvious that he was injured very badly, and he was taken out of the game. He was immediately taken to a hospital. He was checked by several physicians. Their decision was that his injury was not so bad. He could stand the trip back to Ames. So he rode on the train. They made kind of a pad for him to lie on, and that was how he got back to campus. He was put in the student hospital. At first it was thought that he was doing fairly well, but then his breathing would become very shallow, and Jack Trice would die the next day. The student body responded in many ways. The funeral was held on Central Campus. You see a slide of it here. You see the campanile on the right. It was estimated that on the student body of about 4,500 students, probably about 4,000 of the students came to the funeral. They would do something else. They would find big milk cans, and they would place several of these at locations around campus, and they would ask people to donate. The money would pay to send Jack Trice's body back to Ohio for burial. It was known that his mother had taken out a small mortgage on her house in Hiram. The money was to help her repay her mortgage so she wouldn't lose her home. And they estimated that the students collected something like $2,200. Now again, this was in 1923. There were many, many questions about what had happened on that football field. Was Trice deliberately injured? Was he stomped on, as some players had had stated. Did he receive proper medical care? One thing we do know, the authorities did not conduct an official investigation. There was an autopsy. It stated in layman's terms that Jack Trice had been stepped on. His abdomen had been stepped on. There were many, many memorials after Jack Trice's death. First of all, there were notices in newspapers throughout Iowa, notices in newspapers in communities in Minnesota. Here you see two of these. One is the Iowa Stater, which is a student newspaper, and the second one was an article that appeared in a Davenport paper. The one thing that everybody could agree on in terms of Jack Trice's condition and what happened on the field that day, he had carried out this particular maneuver that he had mentioned in his letter. It was called a rolling block. Now, I don't intend to try to pass myself off as any kind of expert about football. I really know very little about the different plays in football. But one thing that I have read about, apparently the rolling block, when you couldn't stop the opposing team, it was looked upon as a dangerous maneuver. A player would literally throw himself in front of the opposing team as it ran down the field. The secret, of course, you were then to trip up the players. But in carrying out this rolling block, the player doing this maneuver had to end up on all fours. Jack Trice ended up on his back. And in the view of some, the Minnesota players simply couldn't stop. I mean, they were running. One at least, maybe more than one, stepped on Jack Trice on his abdomen. As one of the coaches said, lamenting, if only he could have ended up on his back. I should also add here, in terms of some context, this was a time when African American players had to face a great deal of discrimination. It's estimated that in 1923, when Jack Trice played in the varsity team, in the entire Midwest, there were only 7 African American football teams in what were called non-black colleges, such as Iowa State. 7 in the entire Midwest. Black players were sometimes targeted for excessive treatment. One historian has written that even sometimes the player's own teammates would not properly protect that player. Football was regarded as a violent sport. I'm sure many people would probably feel the same way today. But it was very different in the 1920s. Moving back a few years, in 1905, it was estimated that 18 players had been killed playing football up to that point in 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt would be very upset with this. He would call for a conference to see if something could be done to really reduce the violence that was taking place on the football field. As if this were not enough for people like Jack Trice, this was also a time of racial discrimination. Discrimination that took many forms. One of the things that we know, Iowa State would admit black students. That was very clear. But they were told they would have to find their own housing. They could not live in the dormitory. There were different places in Ames. One of these that is well known. In 1919, Archie and Nancy Martin would come from the south. They would build a house on East Lincoln Way, and this would be a rooming house for black students. But in general, people like Jack Trice would arrive and have to find their own housing. There were other types of discrimination. Blacks really were second-class citizens in Iowa in the 1920s. In a theater, I don't know if this was true in Ames, but it was true in Des Moines. The blacks would have to sit in the balcony. Housing. Many communities like Des Moines, Waterloo, had what were called housing covenants, where these were agreements that had been made with real estate agents, where blacks could not be sold a house in certain parts of town. There were restaurants that they couldn't eat in. So when Jack Trice arrived in Iowa, at Iowa State in 1922, he must have really had great apprehension. He must have had some idea of what could happen on that football field. And he certainly, if not before, very soon would become aware of all of the restrictions that would be placed on him. Several of the memorials, this was in the homecoming program. It shows one of the buildings on campus, and then you see the name, his formal name, John Trice. There was even a poem written about Jack Trice. It would appear in a publication in Minnesota. And on the right, you see another photo of Jack Trice. I doubt that you can really read this, but this was the letter that he wrote the night before the game. I might just mention that he wrote the letter, apparently it was only for him to see, and he had tucked it into the pocket of a jacket he was wearing. And it was discovered after his death. The president in Iowa State would read that letter at Jack Trice's memorial service. This is a slide that I think you find interesting. The helmet down in the right-hand corner. These are things that relate to Iowa State at that time. But the helmet is particularly interesting. Descriptions of football in those days, the idea that it was a very rugged sport, very violent sport. The players then, in the 1920s, did not have the kind of padding that players have today. And the helmets, as you can see here, were very different. They were made of leather. They were made to fit down over the head. Not the kind of helmet that would really provide much protection. And in fact, this slide, this photo was taken, I'm not sure if it was a scrimmage or if it was a football game. You see the dome of Beecher Hall in the background. But if you notice, two of these players do not have helmets. Now maybe their helmets have been knocked off while they were in play, but they don't even have the helmets on. Some of the players back east in the 1920s would say a real true man, a rugged man, would not wear any helmet at all. Well, fortunately, probably most players did. After Jack Trice's funeral, and he was buried in Hiram beside by that time his father had died, his mother was living, he would be buried beside his father. His teammates on the football squad would bring together, they would be able to get some funds, and they would put a brass plaque up in State Gym. And you see it here. It contains the letter, not the complete letter that Jack Trice wrote, but most of the letter that he wrote the night before the game. And you see in memory of Jack Trice. Apparently, it was placed far back in the corner where it was really not very visible. From that point on, this was done in 1924, from that point on, the name Jack Trice sort of faded from view. If you ask a student on campus, probably even by 1927, who Jack Trice was, they might not have known. It was not until 1957 that an undergraduate by the name of Tom Emerson, and you see Tom here in the right-hand corner. Tom Emerson was a student, undergraduate, journalism major, editor of the Iowa State Daily. He wrote that one day he was wandering around in State Gym, and he happened to notice this plaque on the wall. He said it was covered with bird droppings, it was covered with grime, but it really intrigued him. So he went over to the library, he did some research, and he would write an article for what was called the Iowa State Scientist. That was actually a student publication and provided an outlet for articles written for students like Tom Emerson. He said that at the time, this created a little bit of a stir, but really not too much. And after this faded from view, it would be, again, a number of years before Jack Trice's name would again come back into public view. Keep in mind, I'm going to go back here, keep in mind the plaque. This plaque will really play an interesting role. It did with Tom Emerson, and it would at a later date as well. In the 1970s, and this would be when interest in Jack Trice surfaced again. In the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, it would be a very different time at Iowa State. I was there on campus during that time, and it always struck me as just such a paradox. You really had almost two Iowa States in terms of the students. You have scenes such as you see here, students sitting on the front steps of a classroom, waiting to go on to the next class, obviously relaxed, dressed very much as students dressed in the 1970s. This is a scene of students walking back and forth to class as seen through some of the pillars in Beardsher Hall. Very tranquil, very collegiate type views at Iowa State. In 1975, the Visha Committee, always an important event at Iowa State. But at the same time, you had a great deal of agitation at Iowa State in the 60s and 70s. This is a photo of Don Smith, the GS leader. I believe he was elected in 1967. Don Smith was a different sort of student. He repaired his motorcycle in his dormitory room, carted in the can of gasoline, washed all the parts, and that sort of thing. This shows Don Smith with fairly short hair. But when he was elected president, the student body, Don Smith had hair, a lot of hair, and I suppose what we would really call rather frizzy hair. Just as an aside, it's one of my favorite stories about this time period. When he was elected president of the student body, there was great interest in the community in Ames in this young man because he was so different than most of the other students. And he was frequently asked to come before different groups and talk about his views of the university, his views on what the student government should do. Well, he showed up one night in front of a church group. He knew it was going to be tough. He knew that they were not going to be very receptive. So he tried to think of some way he could kind of win over his audience before he started to speak. So he was introduced, he stood up, and he said, "You know, I've just washed my hair, and I can't do it." It was a wonderful comment, and I'm sure he did. He did win. But this was the beginning of real turmoil at Iowa State. This was one of the campus rallies, anti-war rally in 1970. This was called the March of Concern. It was at Bishop in 1970, and you had two very divided groups. You had one group that supported the Vietnam War totally. You had other people who did not support the war and felt very strongly that the war should end. This was also the time the Civil Rights Act had been passed in 1964, and so civil rights marches, all of these things were going on. Well, I mention this because this was the context for the time that the Jack Trice story surfaced again. It's very hard to point at one thing or two things and say these clearly resulted in a certain action. But this was the background. It had to create a time when students were defying authority, where students were standing out willing to challenge the status quo, challenge the administration. And I think all of this did play into the next segment of the story, which is really the student campaign to rename the stadium for Jack Trice. One more time, the plaque that you saw would become important. In 1973, in the midst of all of this agitation, a football tutor by the name of Alan Beal would be walking around in State Gym. And lo and behold, what did he see? He saw tucked way back in the corner this plaque with the name Jack Trice. He had no idea who Jack Trice was. He had never heard of Jack Trice. But he was intrigued with what the plaque said. He would go to the library, he would start tracking down a few things, and he would get some information about Jack Trice. He would also tell a friend, Charles Sohn, who was an instructor in the English department at Iowa State. They were good friends, and Alan Beal was able to instill enthusiasm within Charles Sohn about Jack Trice, who was Jack Trice, and the fact that everyone needed to know more. Charles Sohn was an English instructor. Before long, he had introduced the story of Jack Trice to one of his freshman English classes. And before long, that English class decided they wanted to take up a group project, and they wanted to find out everything they could about Jack Trice. They did many, many things. They searched through newspapers, other school publications. They wrote to historical societies in Ohio. They interviewed teammates of Jack Trice. There were at least 3 that they could locate, and they did extended interviews with those 3 men. They put together what is a very impressive notebook on the information that they had acquired about Jack Trice. That notebook is now in special collections. I talked to one of the young women who had been a part of this freshman class. She lives in Ames. She works here now. And she told me that when she first heard of Jack Trice, she was really taken with the story. She grew up on a farm in eastern Iowa. She didn't think she had ever seen a member of a minority group before she arrived at Iowa State. And when she heard the story of Jack Trice, she really felt it was important to be an informed citizen and possibly make a difference at Iowa State. Well, this would eventually lead to another move. And this move would be to name the stadium after Jack Trice. The students in this English class made up petition sheets that they sent out at Visha to get other students to sign and say, we think this new stadium, I should mention this, in 1973, Iowa State was building a new football stadium. And up to that point, it didn't have a name. I'm sure that the administrators very logically were waiting for a big donor to come, help pay off the bill, and the stadium would be named after that donor. Well, the students had other ideas, and they decided, wouldn't it be dandy if that stadium could be named for Jack Trice? They felt that given what Jack Trice had done and the way his life had gone, that he really deserved more more publicity, that more people should know about him. And one more time, the students would go to work. They would interest a great many students on campus, and they would do literally everything. They would form foundations. They would form a number of foundations. The foundations were dedicated toward gathering more information about Jack Trice and pushing the idea of getting the stadium named after him. They would hold fundraisers. They would apply for grants. And in 1988, well, that's what I'm looking for. In 1988, they would have a statue of Jack Trice on Central Campus. It would be dedicated in 1988. You see a photograph of it here, and then you also see up in the right-hand corner, the sculptor was Christopher Bennett, and he was a man who lived in Fairfield. The students raised on their own $22,000 for this statue. They actually had made application to different groups at Iowa State. They had been turned down. They decided they were going to have their statue, and they raised the money. I think one of the things that just interested me so much in all of this, when you see students, and I'm sure this is true almost anywhere, students come in as freshmen. They get caught up in projects. They get caught up in issues during their 4 years. But when they get into their senior year, they get senioritis. And they're anxious to be through. They want to graduate, they want to move on, they want to get a job, and so forth. Somehow, at Iowa State, those students who started this campaign managed to inspire each additional group of students every 4 years. So this campaign went on until 1997. Also, there were two other things here that I did go by. The students were really, I think, quite imaginative. They decided they needed to get the administration's attention. So here you see an article telling about a banner. They raised the money, it was about $150, to hire a pilot to fly over a football game at the stadium, trailing a banner saying, "Welcome to Jack Trice Stadium." Well, it did get attention. They then decided that that didn't last long enough. They needed something that would be up for a longer period of time. So they raised money to put a billboard up along Lincoln Way. Maybe some of you remember this. I don't remember that. But the billboard was up for 1 month. And it was Welcome to Ames, home of Jack Trice Memorial Stadium. They really, really had a tremendous amount of imagination and energy that went into all of this. Again, the story was not confined to Ames. Newspapers all over started picking up the Jack Trice story. It just seemed like a very inspirational story. Many of you probably remember Donald Call's columns in the Des Moines Register. Early on, Donald Call, over the coffee, and with this column, would pick up this campaign. And in his usual, I guess we could say sarcastic manner, would have comments. He would call it No Name Stadium. I should mention that by this time, the name Cyclone Stadium somehow had appeared. It had never been adopted in an official way, but people were starting to call it Cyclone Stadium. Donald Call would call it No Name Stadium. He would rail that he couldn't understand why the administration couldn't make this change. He would say, it doesn't take rocket scientists to figure out that this is a good thing to do. And he said, I think you have some rocket scientists at Iowa State. Even Newsweek magazine would carry an article. This was actually written by someone in Iowa. It was called Once Upon a Time in Iowa. And this would carry the story. And this was another change in the development of naming the stadium after Jack Trice. President Robert Parks in the 1980s thought that maybe a way to kind of quiet down some of the students' imagination and energy on this, name the stadium, the actual physical structure, name that Cyclone Stadium, but name the playing field Jack Trice Field. Well, it probably doesn't take much imagination. It didn't work. In fact, I think if anything, about this point, the students kind of dug in their heels even a little more, saying the administration thinks we'll forget about this, that we'll move on, but we don't intend to do this. Articles in Jet Magazine, articles in newspapers like the Kansas City Star, Minneapolis Star Tribune, small-town newspapers in Minnesota would all carry this story about Jack Trice. Finally, in 1997, the president then of Iowa State, President Jiske, would decide that the time was probably right to make the change for Jack Trice. But even at that point, this was not something that was done quickly. He would probably consult every campus organization to poll them for their particular point of view. The Student Senate, government of the student body, the daily staff, the Committee on the Naming of Buildings and Streets, every committee. Football players were polled. Football coaches were polled. The Board of Regents was polled. The ISU Foundation was polled. Finally, apparently, it looked as if things were going to work out. And in 1997, Jiske would dedicate, before the start of the first football game of the season, would dedicate Jack Trice Stadium. And I should say, you see one here. The logo here would come later, but the stadium would be named Jack Trice Stadium. It would become the only Division 1A school in the nation name its stadium after an African-American athlete. The story of Jack Trice leaves many questions unanswered. How did he himself feel about his time at Iowa State? How was he treated? He did not leave any records. He didn't leave any other letters. There was the letter he wrote on the eve of the football game, but that was the only one that has surfaced anyway. His contemporaries commented, Jack Trice was well respected. Jack Trice was deferential. Jack Trice was shy. Jack Trice was a gracious young man. Jack Trice was a fine student, and he was a great athlete. And what about the question of what happened that day on the football field? I read the letters, the records, the interviews that were there. Some people insisted Jack Trice was intentionally injured. Others, one of the players, two of the players on the field that day, insisted that was not the case, that there were no hard feelings, that they had heard no rumblings, so to speak, among the Minnesota players before the game took place. I think it is really, unless more information would be discovered, really impossible to know if he was targeted that day or if the accident was really an accident. One additional issue that I'd like to comment on here. Finally, how is it that we know now, even though we don't know about that game and exactly what went on, how we know so many other things about Jack Trice? I would like here to play special tribute to the ISU Special Collections through the years, starting out with the letter that Jack Trice wrote, keeping track, collecting the information about this young man and the student campaign. The ISU Library with the student dailies, county historical societies, even in places like Ohio that kept the records through the years, area newspapers, and of course, the Ames Historical Society, which does a marvelous job of collecting the history, preserving that, and making that available in Ames. The story continues. There is one more sculpture that has been completed. This is on what's described as the East Concourse of Jack Trice Stadium. It shows, as you see here, a statue of Jack Trice. It's against the wall. It's described as low relief. And on either side, there are two plaques. And if you are to look at these, they would tell the story of Jack Trice. His beginning in Hiram, Ohio, then the letter he wrote, picture of the football team. Two of these we do have. This would be, I believe, the second plaque, a copy of the letter that he wrote. And then, going back here, then the last two plaques tell what happened in Iowa State and the aftermath at that. So it's another way that Jack Trice is being remembered. The tradition continues. A couple of weeks ago, I got a telephone call from a woman in Des Moines who said that her son and another, his friend, they are fourth graders in Des Moines, that they are very interested in Jack Trice and they're doing school projects or papers on Jack Trice. They're here tonight, and I have to say, I think this is wonderful. Let me first of all say that it's wonderful these boys are interested in history. And second, that they're interested in Jack Trice. That kind of interest continues among people at in many different age levels. So I think this brings us to the end then of the comments that I have. And if anybody would have any questions, you may have been here long enough and you're ready to leave. But if any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer those.
Two things. The plaque that was in the state gym, is that on that wall there?
No, the question was, where's the plaque?
From the state gym?
No, when I first started doing this research, I went over there to find that plaque. And I looked all around and I couldn't see it. I went up to the office and they said that, you know, there has been renovation there, probably a number of times. And that the plaque was taken down. They didn't know where the plaque had gone. Special Collections doesn't have the plaque. No one turned it, you know, no one gave it to them. So I think I can say with some certainty that at least no one at the university knows where this plaque is at. Now, if you go to see the statue of Jack Trice, the freestanding statue, that originally was between Beardshire and Carver on campus. And then once the stadium was named for Jack Trice, they moved that statue over into the stadium area. And if you look at that, they have duplicated the plaque. But it's not the original plaque near the stadium.
One more quick question. Do you know how big Jack Trice was, how tall, what his weight was? Do you know any of his physical?
Yeah, his size. You mean?
Size, yes.
Yes, he was described as 6 feet tall, weighing 200 pounds. And it's interesting, in the pictures that we've seen, he stands above many of the others. He was a big man.
My question is, how many football games did he play in Iowa State? Do you know that? Because you just mentioned, surely he wasn't killed in the second game he played in.
Right, he played on the freshman team, and I don't know how many games they played, but in his sophomore year, when he was on the varsity, he played in two games. And there's some confusion about that, because there were comments made by his contemporaries that, especially Nebraska refused to play with Iowa State because Iowa State had a black player. Well, that's just not true, because Jack Trice only played in the first 2 games. It is true that some football teams refuse to play with another team if they have a black player. University of Iowa had a black player even before Jack Trice came to Iowa State. And University of Missouri had refused to play with the University of Iowa because they had a black player on their team. So that did happen, but not with Jack Trice in just 2 games.
You said Jack Trice was married. Did he have any children?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
You said Jack Trice was married. Did he have any children?
No, there were no children. And unfortunately, there was no picture of his wife. And when you stop to think about it, she came back with him, but then they probably came back at the end of August, and then he died in the first part of October. So she was really here for a very short time. She, when they dedicated the freestanding statue of Jack Trice, somebody, I don't know who it was, sent her the program. So she would know. She later remarried, had several children, and but she did receive all of this information. And she wrote a letter back, and she described her memory of when Jack Trice died, and that she came to Ames with him, that when they left for Minnesota for that football game, he managed to stop by, say goodbye to her there where they lived. And then she was in the union. She didn't say she was working there, but she was in the union. On Monday, when somebody came and said to her, you better go to the infirmary. Your husband's not doing well. And when she got there, he was still alive, but he died shortly after that. But she wrote a very, very touching letter back to Iowa State, thanking them for everything and relating what had happened.
Dorothy, I remember the two gates on the East Concourse display. The gates on either side, what's the symbolism there?
Those gates are replicas of the gates at Clyde Williams Field. It was thought that this would tie in. I think for the sculptor, it also made a nice way of bracketing, but that this would have some sentimental value because this was built from the previous stadium.
I wonder if that letter that his wife wrote still exists. Do we know where it is?
You know,
Do you have the letter that his wife wrote?
yes, that is in special collections at the university. And there's also another letter, which I find so touching. His mother came when he died, and she was here after the funeral. And then she and other relatives took the body back to Ohio. And when she got back to Ohio, she wrote to the president of Iowa State, and she thanked him so much for all the courtesies he had shown her, and the kindness and the money. And then she ended up with just, she wrote, I hope that I'm paraphrasing here, if John's life, she called him John, if John's life meant anything, it will help other students. But Mr. President, please know that I am alone. He was all I had, and the future is so bleak. Just very, very touching. And that letter is in special collections also.
I recall a few years ago that one of his relatives, great nephew, came to study at Iowa State.
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
say something about that? I don't remember.
There are clippings on that when one of his relatives came. I think he came for the dedication of the statue that the students had commissioned. And then one of Jack Trice's would have been quite a great nephew, or was actually a student at Iowa State, if I heard your question right. And I don't know if he finished, I don't know how that worked out. But there's an article or two about him in the Iowa State Daily also.
I was doing some meat shows on Jack Trice, and it said, ISU didn't refuse to play Minnesota for 64 years after that game.
Now, I'm sorry, I just didn't catch that.
I did some meat shows, and it said that ISU did not play Minnesota for 64 years after that game.
Now that could be, I didn't know that. I guess I didn't see any reference to that.